Hi everyone, today I'm talking about a recent study in the field of neuroscience. The title is Fatigue, Boredom, and Objectively Measured Smartphone Use at Work. First, the motivation behind this study is that nowadays people become able to use a smartphone for private matters during working hours. That's almost true. Compared to the past, people can only use their smartphone after work. Use their phone after work. But thanks to the technological advancement and convenience, people are allowed and also asked to use a smartphone during working hours. It has become necessary. Additionally, it is currently not clear how fatigue and boredom relate to smartphone use during work time. So on one hand, both field and laboratory studies suggest the negative effects of smartphone use. But on the other hand, laboratory studies suggest the opposite. The smartphone use has a positive effect. People's attention are recovered after a smartphone use. And the reference, based on motivational models of fatigue and boredom, we can see that when people are distracted, it seems that leisure overvalues labor. So fatigue and boredom should arise. And then people are triggered to switch from labor to leisure. At this point, the balance between them are updated. It's updated. Will be updated, so we can see that the labor will always leisure. And then fatigue or boredom will not be experienced. So people can get back to what they should do. And this cycle completes and can go round and round. And based on this reference, one assumption can be made is that to continue working versus to use one smartphone represents a goal conflict, specifically a conflict between labor goals and leisure goals, called labor versus leisure decision. Labor task is productive and mentally demanding, whereas leisure tasks, of course, not productive, and it won't tax your brain's ability. In leisure tasks, you just relax and unwind. And there's some additional assumptions. First is that smartphone is a highly rewarding alternative to work tasks. And this is especially true among young people because you can see that young people are more dependent on their phone usage. Second, there is considerable inter-individual variability in how much people enjoy to be on their phone. So one important parameter is FOMO. This study has taken account of this parameter. And FOMO stands for fear of missing out. It's an emotional status that you fear missing important events when not unlooking your smartphone at a particular time. And the third is that fatigue and boredom act as a stop motion that trigger disengagement from current task. And to compare them, the major difference is the cause. Fatigue arises due to a low cognitive resources. And the boredom will arise because of insufficient stimulation. So based on these assumptions, we can make two hypotheses. And these two hypotheses based on one concept. This concept is that the bidirectional relationship between stop motion, that is fatigue and boredom, and smartphone use. So the experiment first, it's very important to collect data before any data analysis, so you can have the material to do a following experiment. So first, participants are recruited, and the following are the inclusion criteria. So before a study, a questionnaire is also taken. And this questionnaire is based on the inter-individual variability I mentioned before. So during the study, there are two ways collecting data. First is self-report data, and it's Qualtrics questionnaire regarding fatigue and boredom. And some levels, people will check themselves to fill in the questionnaire. But for self-report data, it's not enough. So there are another ways is objective smartphone use data. So before study, the participants are asked to install the login application. And this application is very important for the tracking, the detection of smartphone usage during the study. So after the data collection, the calculation of smartphone use, will based on 20 minutes after and before self-reports. Self-report means the questionnaire, the qualtrics questionnaire. So the data points will be excluded when they are overlapped with the start time of work, end time of work, or lunch break. So here's the preliminary results. In the figure 1a, we can see in the 20-minute time frame the distribution of smartphone use. So you can see that this distribution is not normal, and a positive and a possible reason for that is that a higher number of time individuals during which participants did not interact with their smartphone at all. And as for the 1 day time frame, we can see that there's no significant difference. So we can exclude any context of the day that have the difference on the entire predictors we work on. And in figure 1c, we can see that the development of fatigue over the working day. And in this figure, we can see that it's non-linear. Although we can see that the latter seems linear, but at first it's not. There's slightly elevated levels of fatigue in the early morning, right? On average, fatigue increased by about 20 points from the morning to the afternoon. And development of boredom over the working day. We can see that in this plot, the same trend is not observed in the boredom. Which steadily increase throughout the day. It's linear. But in the 1C, it's non-linear, right? It's non-linear, but it's linear, right? But overall, both fatigue and boredom increase over the course of the working day. So to prevent any correlation, we should check the correlation between fatigue and boredom. Hopefully, the correlation is very low, so the collinearity problems can be avoided. Fatigue and boredom are separate predictors. And the distribution of FOMO, we can see that most are in the median levels. So we can also exclude this problem. So here comes the data analysis. First, Bayesian linear mixed effects modeling is used. And because it is used because the distribution is not normal. So it's not general standard linear modeling. It's a special modeling method. So there are some predictors, and these predictors have different poverty, right? We can say they have different poverty. If it's continuous within subjects, it's fatigue and boredom, but it's between subjects, which means the value is generated based on the comparison between subjects. It's FOMO. And categorical means all or none. So whether or not, whether participants use their smartphone at all. The answer is yes or no. It's not a value, so it's categorical. So after the Bayesian modeling, the fitting of two models are operated. First is binomial model. This model is qualitative. And zero infinite bound model is quantitative. So quantity means all or none, yes or no. And quantity means a particular value, more and more or less. Especially for this relationship. So the following results, there's a structure. So in this structure, you can see that there are binomial model, zero infinite bound model, fatigue boredom. And it's very important. We can see that in binomial model, the parameters will be transformed into odds ratio. It's very important. And for zero infinite bound model, the parameter will be transformed. Will be standardized. This means that the average is 0. So it's very important benchmark. Okay, so first, the investigation of the effect of fatigue and boredom on subsequent smartphone use will be discussed. So, as for the fatigue, okay, fatigue on the likelihood that the smartphone was used. For this plot, we can see that as fatigue increases by half a standard deviation, participants are estimated to be 1.66 more likely to interact with their smartphone in the following 20 minutes. Neither FOMO nor the interaction between fatigue and FOMO seem to have a noticeable effect on the likelihood to use their smartphone. Right, we can see that the dot is close to 1, especially for the rightist plot. The dot is less than 1, which means this predictor is a protective factor. Yeah, the correlation is very low. Yeah, there's no correlation. Okay. And posterior distribution of our model of the effect of boredom. Yeah, so it changes for the boredom. Yeah. Okay, so you can see that in this model also FOMO has no effect at all, right? Yeah, and it's very important. We can see that as the boredom increases by half a standard deviation, participants are estimated to be 1.43 times more likely to interact with their smartphone. As for the beta zero inflated model, we can see that as fatigue increases by half a standard deviation, participants are estimated to use their smartphone for 28 seconds more in the subsequent 20 minutes. And it's very important that FOMO has some effect in this figure. We can see that it has some effect. Yeah, because it's not close to 0, so it has some effect. Okay, so the model further estimates that participants have a standard deviation higher than the average in FOMO use their smartphone for 39 seconds more in 20 minutes. But interaction is close to 0. And as for boredom, we can see that there's also specific effect, especially when boredom increases by half a standard deviation. Participants are estimated to use their smartphone for 10 seconds more. Yeah, it's very significant. Okay, because the credible interval is really far from 0. Unsurprisingly, okay, the model once more estimates the participant have a standard deviation higher than the average in FOMO use their smartphone for 37 seconds more in 20 minutes. Okay, it's not close to 0, so it's also some correlation. Yeah, FOMO has some effect in the relationship between boredom and smartphone use. But as for the interaction, we can say that it is less than 0, and we can say that it's lower. Yeah. So the model also estimates weak evidence that the relationship between boredom and subsequent smartphone use may be stronger for those participants lower in FOMO. Yeah. If they are lower in FOMO, maybe they will use their smartphone more. Maybe the boredom and the smartphone use relationship will be stronger. So we can make conclusions for the figure 2 and 3. There is some evidence for a small effect of fatigue and boredom on the decision to interact with the smartphone, which is consistent with the hypothesis 1. However, there is no evidence for the effect of fatigue and boredom on the amount of time, the duration of the smartphone used. Okay, provided that it is used at all. So the finding does not support hypothesis 1. However, there is some evidence that FOMO did have some effect. Okay. Participants higher in FOMO use their smartphone more, right? Part 2 will investigate the effect of smartphone use on subsequent fatigue and boredom. Yeah, it just comes from the opposite way. So first, likewise, is a binomial model. In this plot, we can see that fatigue is estimated to be higher by 0.89 points as the smartphone was used in 20 minutes, okay, before the hourly questionnaire. Okay, so you can see that is very significant, is far from, is close to zero. Yeah, it's close to zero. And it's very important. You can see that smartphone use will infect a person's start emotion. Okay. And as for boredom, it's almost the same. Yeah. If the smartphone was used, boredom is estimated to be higher by 1.32 points. Okay. And for the posterior distribution model of the effect of total smartphone use on subsequent fatigue, in this plot, you can see that as the smartphone use increases by 80 seconds, which means have a standard deviation, fatigue is estimated to be higher by 0.88 points. And again, FOMO has no effect. Yeah, it's close to zero, right? As for boredom, okay, as boredom will be increased by 3.94 points if the smartphone use increases by half a standard deviation. Okay, and again, FOMO has minor effects, right? So here comes the conclusions. There's some evidence for a small effect of whether or not the smartphone was used on the subjective experiences of fatigue and boredom. However, this effect is in the opposite direction to hypothesis 2. Right? Yeah. Remember the hypothesis 2? Hypothesis 2 means that after more smartphone use, people experience less fatigue and boredom. But in this study, you can see that as people use a smartphone, they become more fatigued and bored. Yeah, so it's in the opposite way. And there's some evidence for a small effect of smartphone use on subjective experiences of fatigue, and especially boredom. Okay, boredom has more significant results, more significant difference. Also, is in the opposite direction. So we can make some inference with regard to fatigue. Is worth noting that switching back and forth between two different tasks is often thought to be cognitively costly itself. So why people become fatigued and bored, more fatigued and bored after smartphone use instead of less fatigued and bored? Yeah, it may due to the cost of the switch cost, right? Switch back and forth is very distracting. And second, with regard to both fatigue and boredom, it could be that briefly interacting with one smartphone, rather than motivating people and to work hard, reinforces the higher value of leisure over labor. Yeah, so the labor will not always leisure. Okay, it's very counter-effective. Yeah, counterproductive. You can see that the leisure have more value than before after smartphone use. Okay, so it's maybe another inference. So we can sum that from a theoretical perspective. This study is among the first to test predictions by motivational accounts of fatigue in a real-world setting, and it provides a first test of what happens to fatigue and boredom directly after labor to leisure switches. Okay, and last thing is very important. Experiencing fatigue and boredom seem to be related to an increased likelihood to interact with one smartphone, and in turn, smartphone use seem to be related to an increase in experience fatigue and boredom. Okay, so thank you for attention, and there's some time, so I will get to the discussion. So you can see that there are other factors that likely predict whether or not people use a smartphone. And these factors will include whether the message are get or not. Yeah, are gotten or not. So you can see there are some factors. That will be the interruptant. Yeah, okay. But don't worry, because when people are very fatigued and bored, they seem to have substantially more likely to disengage from their work. So the main factors will be fatigue and boredom, not whether or not they receive their message. and here's another explanation for a contradiction. Okay, so in terms of the hypothesis 2, this study is inconsistent with previous field study, right? We can say the previous field study states that after smartphone use, people become less fatigued and bored. They will be recovered and can get back to their work. But in this study, we can see that after smartphone use, people are more fatigued and bored than before. So these effects are very small, right? Okay, so we can say that this experiment cannot be seen as a very confirmative experiment. This experiment is exploratory because this effect is very small compared to a field study. Yeah, field study has a significant difference, but in this study, you can see that as the smartphone use increases, okay, the levels of stop motion only increases by single digit, right? Okay, so it's very small. And FOMO did not strengthen the relationship between fatigue and boredom and smartphone use, right? Although FOMO did have some effect, but generally it did not strengthen relationships. So we can say there's some possible explanation for that result. Even though FOMO is related to higher smartphone use, it does not reflect a higher valuation of the smartphone use. Yeah, so the value is not changed. So FOMO is similarly related to the higher smartphone use, but in essence, it's not. Okay, in fact, it's not. And the notion is that people should get fatigued faster depending on the value of the leisure alternative is false. And this may be true, yeah. If the notion is false, then that thing can be explained for the results, right? Okay, because all the concepts are based on the values of leisure and labor. And there's something to be noted, okay? There's something to note, okay? First is that pre-register analysis plan wasn't followed, yeah, because there are some unforeseen circumstances, including the planned sample size wasn't reached, and mixed-level linear modeling approach wasn't viable due to the distribution. Yeah, it's not normally distributed, so the normally linear model is not used. Instead, a Bayesian model is used. Yeah, so the alternative analysis plan is followed rather than pre-registered hypothesis sample size. An analysis plan based on the hypothesis and recent developments in the field. So it's very important that the results can only be considered exploratory. Yeah, and it's not fully conclusive. Yeah, more research is necessary. And given the specificity of our sample, our results cannot be generalized, yeah, because it's only limited to the PhD students, PhD candidates, and their specific group. But hopefully, yeah, there will be some demands for the high social status. Yeah, this study may be very suitable for those who are working in a high social rank. Okay, so thanks for listening.